We could call the workshop to order now, please. Uh, I'll try one more time. We're going to call the meeting to order, please. We will have a staff report for our workshop. Is this from our senior planner, Sean McNicholas?
Yes, thank you, Planning Commission. Sean Nicholas, Senior Planner. This is the public workshop associated with the 2019 zoning ordinance cleanup. A little bit different this year than in years past. As you all know, that in the years past there are more low-hanging fruits, which we tried to address through these cleanup processes, and we've gone through a process where we would write up potential code changes and additions and go through step-by-step, point-by-point with the commission during this time period and get feedback, take public comments, and adjust accordingly, and then come back for a decision. Today, we're going to do more of an introduction to some concepts that we're hoping to get feedback from in terms of being able to get to the point where we are developing that initial language to ultimately bring back before the Planning Commission. Obviously, component of that is to take public comment and then ultimately provide any additional feedback to city staff. And today we're going to be talking about two issues associated, one issue associated with parking modifications, particularly off-site joint use parking, and a key component of off-site joint use parking is the concepts of walking distance and walkability. So we'll get into all of that and then have a discussion, as well as a discussion regarding a landscape issue that's been brought to staff's attention by a number of residents, and potential options what staff has been able to put together in terms regarding the issue, and then again some discussion points to help staff develop that starting point in terms of code. So again, I just want to make it clear to anyone in the public as well is that there's no code here that's being adopted. There's no provisions that's being adopted. It's just a discussion on some of these concepts to eventually help staff to put together those code sections. So unless there's any questions, I'm going to jump right into the parking. Seeing none, we're going to kick it off. So in all communities, there's some kind of parking issue in some form or fashion. Here in Dana Point, we have a number of studies that have shown that we have parking stocks in our various commercial districts. It's just that they're underutilized at this time. And a key component to better utilizing or more efficiently utilizing and opening up those parking spaces is our off-site joint use parking tool. But unfortunately, at least I can tell you in the 3+ years that I've been here, we've never processed. No one's ever applied for the off-site joint use, and it's not a tool that's regularly used, unfortunately. And looking at it, it appears that perhaps the 300-foot limitation might be a big component of that. And so staff started looking at ways in which to evaluate how to open that up more. And again, this would apply to all commercial areas, not residential districts, and also not associated with any residents associated with any mixed-use development concept. You know, all that residential parking would still be on site. But it does look at all commercial areas in the community and the potential for it. And so instead of looking at all the commercial areas, staff looked at Town Center as a kind of a case study, and for a particular reason, which we'll get into, to evaluate these concepts and introduce these concepts of walking distance and walkability, and how it applies to obviously promoting and potentially using more of the off-site joint use parking tool. And a key component of that is opening up parking for potentially employees versus customers and potential incentives associated that. So that way it opens up, again, more for the public and getting them off the streets and out of some of our residential areas and more utilizing that parking stock. So jumping into it, here's a picture that everyone is, I know, very familiar with. This is our Town Center area, starting at the north there with the Point and Tudor and Spunky's shopping center there at Green Lantern, and going down to Copper Lantern there on the south end, just south of Carlos's Mexican restaurant. For context, as the crow flies, it's about just over 3/4 of a mile, so not quite a whole mile. And then at the widest point there with La Plaza is just over a quarter of a mile, and just for reference, approximately the midpoint would be, distance-wise, would be right around Violet Lantern on both PCH and Del Prado. Now, the key component as to why we utilized Town Center as part of this case study is because more so than, for an example, Doheny Village or the Harbor, there's more of a grade difference that occurs here. So in terms of evaluating walking distance and walkability as it relates to parking and off-site parking agreements, we wanted to take into the fact that there was about an 80 to 90 foot grade difference as you move from south to north going up PCH and Del Prado. So that just kind of gives you some base points and some reference points as we start into this discussion of walkability and walking distances. So taking a look at the existing code, this is what 300 feet looks like, and that's centered around the Ralph Shopping Center, which does have a parking surplus. And in terms of you can see both zoomed in and on the larger picture on the bottom, zoomed out in the limited commercial areas that could potentially take advantage of that parking surplus of the Ralph Center, which could potentially help with reinvestment in that area, also filling vacant tenant spaces as they currently are with retail or restaurant uses. Similarly, here's on our north end, that potentially taking advantage of some parking opportunities, utilization during off-peak hours of that shopping center for some more of those commercial districts. Again, commercial uses that could operate, but again, very limited in the commercial areas that impacts. And again, if there was any underutilized in Violet Lantern, you can see the spaces, but most importantly, they don't ever overlap. So there's no really opportunity for large areas to be able to utilize off-site joint parking throughout the town center. So again, this gets us into looking at, well, 300 feet has gotten us this far. What is actually acceptable walking distance? Well, for about 25 years now, a quarter mile has been kind of the gold standard, if you will, for acceptable walking distance, and that's based on a number of journals and academic studies. And that equates to about a 5-minute walk. So what does that look like in terms of if we expanded that 300-foot radius to a quarter mile? So you guys start to see a much larger area in terms of potential opportunities to enter into off-site parking agreements, and kind of similar on the north end, in the middle, and then all three. We're starting to see more overlap in those opportunities. Well, staff dug deeper. And actually, recent academic studies have shown that there's been a shift in how people utilize parking and view parking, especially in commercial districts that we have here in Dana Point, like the town center, like the Doheny Villages, like the Dana Point Harbor, is that it suggests 10 minutes is now becoming a very acceptable walking distance. So extends that out to about a half mile. Now, there is some caveats, obviously. If people are still driving to get their groceries, people want to park right there at their grocery store, and they don't want to walk that distance. They want to get their groceries and leave. But when looking at it from the context that this is a park once walkable, vibrant commercial district, the concept of being able to walk further to dinner, to entertainment, to shopping, to the retail, to the commercial uses in these areas in a park once multiple destination facility, 10 minutes is a very acceptable distance in walking time. So what does that mean in terms of looking at it? It's if town center is just over 3/4 of a mile, or just, 3/4 of a mile, then you should be able to walk, in essence, the walking distance through all of downtown in just about 10 minutes. So that means that all of downtown, potentially all those underutilized spaces, could be open in opportunities for off-site parking agreements. Now, walking distance and, again, walkability, they're related, but they are two very different concepts in terms of, why would people want to walk? Is it comfortable to walk? And those types of issues. So in our case study, is town center walkable? And we'll also talk about the context of how it applies to Doheny Village and the Harbor. So there is actually a website called thewalkscore.com, and it is a website that looks at various communities from a high level down to, in some cases, the street level, and grades the walkability of those areas. And staff was obviously skeptical to trying to make sure that we're looking at accurate information. And there's been actually a number of academic studies, especially out of Harvard, that's been evaluating the methodology behind how they score these areas, and have determined that they are actually very accurate measures of walkability of an area. So we thought that that was a good sign in terms of looking at and comparing our, walking distance and taking it a step further about, are these areas walkable? So here we have, looking at Dana Point as a whole, it got a score of about 52, so somewhat walkable. But you can see here in this image, if the mouse, which does not show up with, we're using our secondary computer laptop, but you can see there in the screen, which kind of looks like on the monitor there, a yellowish blob, maybe on your screens in front of you shows up green like it's supposed to, that the more green areas are in the town center and actually in the Doheny Village portions. So looking at that more focus in the downtown area, which it does evaluate, you can see it's considered a walker's paradise. And based on the components in which they look at, associated with making walkability and usability of the area and comfort of that, you can see things like dining and restaurants, groceries, shopping, errands, parks, all of those combined to making it a very walkable and complete area in which it creates that comfort and for those longer walking distances, especially in the town center. But wanting to look at it in those frameworks and components that make town center walkable, looking at the harbor, while there's not a lot of detailed information yet on the walkscore.com regarding the harbor, you can see that the same framework of those types of uses, especially along that Golden Lantern corridor and along the harbor there with the retail and restaurants, it's that same kind of components that makes the town center walkable by that score in the harbor. And again, even in Doheny Village, looking at it, you still see, again, these opportunities about the framework and the foundation regarding these types of uses and mix of uses to create this walkable area and opportunities to potentially utilize more of a expanded offsite joint use parking to better utilize our parking resources. So again, we wanted to grind down to make sure in terms of Dana Point, is this ground truth? Is this really a reality? And again, in our case study of looking at this from the standpoint of town center, we wanted to look at how does the topography there potentially impact, again, the walkability and the walking distances, and how does that impact it? Can you really walk down town center in about a 10-minute walk? And so in all things, when you need to have people go out and work out on a hot, sunny day and get this kind of ground truth, you always send your intern. And that's what we did. And we sent our intern out to walk that and to take a lot of different measurements for us. It was on Friday, April 12th, in which they went on a warm, sunny day. It was about mid to high 70s, much better than the June that's fortunately just passed. 10 a.m., so it was a pretty good example of a typical beautiful day here in the city of Dana Point. And then taking it at a normal strolling pace, the pace that you would take it with your family, your loved ones, your friends, walking in this type of commercial district, Park One's district. And so what did we find? We found walking down PCH, it took about 17 minutes to go from Green Lantern down to Copper Lantern. But a key component of that, it was 6 minutes and 30 seconds were spent at the three different manned or controlled crosswalks you can see kind of marked by that hourglass emblem. So when you take out that waiting time, it took of walking about 11-ish minutes to walk from the top end downhill to Copper Lantern. So coming back, again, what would be potentially, if there was going to be a topographic impact, coming back up and taking the Del Prado route, the time actually took 13 minutes and 16 seconds because there's only 2 minutes at the controlled intersection at Golden Lantern and Del Obispo, or Del Prado, I apologize. And so, again, right around that 10, 11-minute walkway. So you can see that, again, that strolling didn't really impact that walkability, that comfort level of being able to utilize town center and access town center within that 10-ish minute proximity and goal. So what does this all tell us? Is that it looks like our key kind of commercial districts and all the commercial areas are walkable and are going to fit into that walking distance and that walkable kind of key characteristics that make a place easier to walk, which then opens up the potential opportunity to more utilize off-site joint parking in those areas that are multi-destinational, that parking once concept. And as I said, we looked at it in those three kind of categories of commercial districts of the town center, harbor, and Doheny Village. which then brings us to the discussion points associated with parking in this particular discussion that staff is looking for feedback this evening from Planning Commission. Regarding if there is to be potential changes to that off-site joint use parking requirements, what is in terms of the position of the planning commissioners on what would be an appropriate distance and what they feel could potentially work for, again, thinking in a broad scope of all of our commercial districts. And then if it should be expanding, and if there's interest and feedback from the planning commission that there should be, staff should evaluate expanding it and to a certain point, should there be limitations on the percentage of parking that's provided off-site? And what should that be? 20% of the required parking of a subject property or development, 30%, 50%, whatever that number is. And then potential ways in incentivizing workforce versus patrons. So that way we open up, again, those underutilized parking spaces, hopefully create it so it's available to patrons, but also creating more opportunities for parking for the employees, again, within these walkable areas to then create on-site parking more for the base users for our restaurants and our retails and our commercial spaces. So that kind of gets us to the end and kind of discussion points and focus points of the parking discussion. I will turn it back to Planning Commission. Would you like to provide comments at this point on these issues, or would you like me to continue to the landscape issues and then you can provide comments at the end?
Any comments?
I have a few questions, and I'm happy to do it either way.
Okay. Let's talk about parking first, and then we'll go on to the next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, Sean, a couple questions for you on that map you showed us that had a 300-foot radius, I think it was.
Yes, sir.
Do you know were you measuring from the boundary of the property line?
Yes,
around
sir.
Around all the property?
It was from the extent of the property line. That's 300 feet out.
Okay, and do we have a map showing a quarter mile out within the Landry
Here's
district?
the three locations at a quarter mile out. And you can see that starts to get overlap at that quarter mile.
Right. Okay. So one question that I have is I know that we at one point had a parking in lieu fee or some option for parking in lieu. In the case of paying that fee, what type of distance are they allowed to? I guess they don't even have to assume, but that money's supposed to go to build something. So how far away would that structure typically be built with funding?
So there isn't a specific distance limitation with the in lieu fee. To date, actually, we've not had any applicants pursue that. They've either provided on site, or as Sean has indicated, they've explored joint use. There's been a few limited opportunities where they've been able within the 300 feet to make it work. But beyond that, we haven't done anything.
Okay. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that if we were to do, if we got flooded with money, that we would look to the town center area for a parking structure. So, part of my thinking would be we should be looking at that district as an entire, if you're in that district. But I do have concerns relative to the neighborhood. This is a program that's complex. The type of use, every use has a different need. So, from your daily needs type retailer to a restaurant, they have different types of activity in and out. And there's some of them are seasonal and some of them aren't. So I think all those are things that I'd be wanting to know more about. In addition, you did talk a little bit about the elevation change, but it can be pretty dramatic depending on if you go up or down from town center. I was looking at I walked from my house to Coastal Kitchen this weekend, and it took a little bit more than 15 minutes, which is pretty far. I'm not in the district. But you have to climb up a pretty steep elevation to get there, and I was huffing and puffing, and I'm relatively in shape. So we just definitely want to look at how do we deal with the path of travel and ensure that we don't encourage people to encroach into neighborhoods if we're doing this, additional shared parking. And I am concerned about the half mile. That's quite a distance. So if you, in the next meeting, could get us the studies that you guys are looking at, just so we can see them ourselves, that'd be great. That's it.
Sean, I had a couple of questions. We have a task force on parking. Does that information, has that been vetted with the task force, or do we have separate input from the task force?
So this is part of that.
Yeah, I can jump in, having sat on the task force as well. This was an issue identified as something that was in need of further development and prioritizing in this year's zoning ordinance update as one of the short-term goals. Again, the 300-foot distance just doesn't seem to be being utilized, although we know there are a number of vacant spaces in town. And when I say vacant spaces, it's based on time of day and use. And so, you could have a medical office that closes at 5 and a restaurant that opens around 5, and those spaces remain available, but under the current provisions, if it's beyond 300 feet, they can't be utilized. So we're really trying to find where's that ideal space. And I should add that we're not recommending a half-mile distance. We're kind of showing the outer limit of what at least our contemporary research is showing. 300 is sort of one end of the spectrum where we're not seeing it, and we wouldn't be able to support anything beyond a half mile. I think somewhere in that range is where we're looking to get feedback, and obviously not to make a decision tonight, but understanding where areas you want. I think Commissioner Nelson brought up a good point with topography. That's something we can certainly factor in when we bring back some options for you, and we're open to other suggestions as well.
I know we also have talked about the different uses. So the restaurants at night, Coastal Kitchen is some evenings totally packed on the weekends, and yet there's a shopping center across the street that's sort of empty. But I know that the owner of the shopping center is not interested in providing parking. So we have some issues, even though the potential is there. Making that happen is another issue. And so I guess that comes under the shared parking. And I guess the other piece that I was looking at is we have the town center, we have the harbor, and we have Doheny Village, where we have the potential for parking areas in each of those locations. But without having some mode of transportation from the harbor to the town center and vice versa, or Doheny Village, then it may not be possible to have enough parking for key events on special events, I guess, without having some mode of transportation. And also, you mentioned the employees versus the customers. Do we have any program now for any incentive for the employees to be parked off-site? And for example, off Selva, we have a large parking area for the beach, and it seems like that's not too far distant to be able to transport people, and say employees could park there and not park downtown. So I guess just off the top of my head, those were some of my comments.
I think one of my main comments is timing for reconsideration, because a lot of the shopping centers around here have been in flux as to whether they're occupied or not and what type of establishments are there. So if you do implement something, what would be the time period that would be good for, and you would go back for any reconsideration?
I guess at this time, I would invite some public comments, if we have any. Does anybody care to address the workshop? And if you would, just fill out a speaker's form and hand it to our secretary. Yeah.
Chairman Donor, we do have one speaker slip, but it seems to be specific to the landscape ordinance. So unless we have any other takers, We certainly can put in a slip right now.
I'm sorry, I did put my name. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I did put my name down to speak on the landscaping side, and particularly about views. But listening to your discussion was very interesting. And although I'm a little bit old to be an intern, we are very experienced walkers. And maybe if you wanted 1 minute of feedback about how we view the walkability issue, if that would help you, I don't know. But
We appreciate your feedback. If you just tell us
Sure.
who you are and make and
we
fill
have a
out one of the
slip, so
forms,
we're-
please.
yes.
Yeah.
My name is Julian Joshua. We've been residents of Dana Point and homeowners for the last 10 years. And as you can hear from my accent, we are used to walking. People in Europe are used to walking, perhaps a little bit less so here but I think there may well be a difference between walkability at night and walkability during the day, because while we'd be quite willing to walk long distances around Dana Point during the day, I think it becomes a little bit less attractive at night in the dark. I don't know whether that affects your considerations, but it may be something you'd like to take into account. Thank you.
That's why the people in Europe maybe are thinner than the people in the U.S. Hoine Iep. I butchered that. Can you help me out, please?
I guess that was it. Hoyan, yep.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
I like to start with actually first, I want to say it is a long distance to go from Doheny village to the town center, so we shouldn't expect people to do that. I think I heard that discussion at the city council meeting too. How far is half mile? From town center, if we do the half mile radius, how far is the far edge? I'm just thinking that half mile is very doable, I think. One personal experience is that a friend lives exactly 1 mile away, and she loves to do large parties. So there's no parking. So we just all walk to her place. So, I mean, if it's exciting, people are more willing to walk. That's the case in Laguna Beach too, right? It's exciting, it's beautiful. Even at night, people walk and walk and walk, right? And from Broadway up to North Laguna, actually there's a little bit hill there, but people walk with their lunchbox, the stuff that tourists take stuff, right? They bring stuff in. So I think probably half mile is pretty good benchmark. If we cannot stretch more, beautification is something the city council talked about a number of times, and Paul mentioned adding street art. So I think this will all help in the end when things come together. Sorry, I don't have more to say.
Okay, we have no other public comments. Then, Sean, if you have any other issues on the parking, then we'll move on to the next area.
Sorry, excuse me, let me get there. All right. So, turning the page, now talking about landscaping. As we all know, landscaping, it's a living, breathing entity and matures over a very long period of time. Currently, in terms of the way that landscaping is evaluated here, we look at it primarily what the state requires us having to do with water usage, drought tolerant. There's really no analysis of mature heights in terms of landscaping requirements in general, other than in our hedges, fences, and wall portion of our zoning code. There really is no height limits associated with landscaping. And staff evaluating our code saw that we have limits for structures and regulations associated with structures, both in developable areas and in our setback areas. And so after looking at that, staff took a position that perhaps there's opportunities to discuss potential standards. Now, just to understand, again, issues to keep in mind is that here in the city of Dana Point, we do not protect private views, though we are getting complaints on this issue. And so that's why we are bringing it forward for discussion here. to the Planning Commission. And I just wanted to highlight that you're going to see a lot of different images on these upcoming slides, and they're just meant to show you, they're all pictures here from Dana Point that we went out and found, and they're just examples of different types of kind of landscape concerns that we've heard about, so just to give you kind of references. So in terms of evaluating this landscape issue, we first looked to many of our surrounding communities, especially other high quality of life coastal communities in Southern California. And really, out of that evaluation, it kind of came down to two ways of thinking regarding landscaping management, and that's either from a reactive or a proactive standpoint and approach. So in terms of a proactive approach, an example would be requiring a citywide plant list in which no vegetation would be selected for the community that at mature heights would not exceed whatever limitations are set. And so taking into account both the drought tolerant and trying to create as much of a diverse plant palette as possible. And then gets into questions regarding potential triggers, when that would come into account in terms of when you require that landscaping to meet that to meet these new potential standards. When someone does a structure remodel or addition, is it when a landscape remodel triggers a landscape permit, which in our current code today we do have thresholds of when a landscape permit is required. Is it just when something is scraped or new development on new undeveloped piece of property, or is it complaint driven? And if we go more with the complaint driven process, that does start getting us into more of a reactive approach in terms of landscape maintenance and management. Through that, there's always a goal of neighborhood coordination and getting the neighbors involved in the process. There also becomes questions regarding distances in which would be appropriate to have the reactive approach be taken into account, and all of the various jurisdictions utilize different distances from a subject property that is complaining on a property that has the vegetation in question. And then there becomes a lot of discussion on all of these processes regarding the views on the complaints of the subject property versus the privacy, their rights to privacy that the landscape provides for the property owner that has this landscaping. And they're finding that balance between those two issues. And then do you develop in exemptions, things like having mature trees that are maybe important for some reason or another in a neighborhood? Or is it if it's under a certain height, depending on whether it's located within a building envelope or a setback, that it can't be, that it's exempt? Or if it's part of a project or a home that's been developed and has an approved landscape plan that's come before Planning Commission, should they be allowed to develop and have that because that's been reviewed as part of the process, and should they be exempt? So these are, again, some of the kind of the issues that staff started trying to see as potential discussion points. And then that ultimately leads us to enforcement. And there was a variety of things we've already talked about. When do we trigger the enforcement of these types of requirements if new development standards were to be put into place? Again, as we said, and what is the city process, and then ultimately the city's involvement? Is there public hearings if we would get complaints to hear neighborhood concerns? Is there forced compliance, or is the city process just the trigger gets hit when you're doing a remodel or you're hitting that landscape permit, and you have to now install landscaping that's compliant with these new development standards, right? And that's, again, the reactive versus proactive stance. And then costs. All things are involved with costs, depending on, is it cost to the residents in terms of installing new landscaping, or costs associated with coming through a process with a complainant and who's responsible for immediate change to landscaping and also long-term maintenance. So that ultimately, again, brings us back to kind of the key components and discussion points that we would like to get feedback on this evening in helping staff in terms of creating a starting point on potential development standards associated with better regulating landscaping in Dana Point. So again, the concept, just for a refresher, is the concept of a citywide plant list something, again, a proactive approach that Planning Commission feels that that's a better way to look at drought tolerant but yet lower mature heights. Actually, as part of this process, we contacted our contract landscape architect Pat Murphy with Summers Murphy and Associates, who do have a long history, obviously, here in Dana Point, surrounding cities across this country, as well as internationally. And he has indicated that there is ways, and a lot of communities have gone towards that, especially internationally, in terms of those plant lists to create diversity, so you don't have every homogenous style, but still meets the needs of the community in addressing some of these issues. And again, issues of triggers for replacement. Is existing landscaping grandfathered? Is it triggered by new development? By just requiring it with new development, it would create an incremental change as areas are improved and redeveloped. And that's typically how also think of non-conforming situations, how we ultimately potentially bring issues into conformances where they get redevelopment or cross a certain threshold. Again, and then thinking about the city's involvement in this process, whether it's a complaint-driven public hearing process or, again, just implementing development standards during some kind of triggering point, and then whether there should be potential development standards associated with heights within or without, inside or outside of those setbacks, and then potential costs and thinking about who should be involved with that. So there's a lot there, I know, but those are kind of things we are hoping to kind of unfold and unpack and get some feedback this evening regarding these issues, again, to start developing some language. So that concludes my presentation. Again, turn it back to Planning Commission for any questions or thoughts you'd like to share.
I'll start with the left.
I think that's the first time I've ever been accused of being on the left, by the way. I was not aware of this kind of depth of consideration was going to be going into a landscaping issue. So with that said, I haven't given it a lot of pre-thought relative to giving feedback. In concept, I'm opposed to view preservation, but I like the concept of a citywide plant list. I think actually that sounds good to me. If on a go-forward basis, if approved trees are, we kind of make it specified that there's a list and ones that aren't going to be as intrusive, visually intrusive, as other ones, to kind of over time minimize problems on a go-forward basis. I think that's good. I think existing should be grandfathered. I think I'm just looking at your list here. I don't like being reactive relative to complaint-based. I haven't given any thought to inside or outside of setbacks. Are you talking? And I haven't reviewed I was reading Mr. Joshua's letter here, and relative to referencing Laguna Beach's ordinance and potentially any other city's ordinances as well. So I haven't reviewed those. I would be interested in having those and reviewing those and kind of seeing. I feel like I'm kind of trying to invent the wheel here, or being asked to invent the wheel that I haven't even looked at a piece of stone. So I would want to have some other basis and information, but to kind of make informed, thoughts.
So I guess I have a couple questions. What is there a true goal or objective to this, or is it just discussion? Or
Yeah, I would say it's discussion. Like I said earlier, that this is a concern that we are hearing from the community, and we have gotten a number of complaints regarding maintenance and mature landscaping and what could be potentially done on this. And so again, kind of as I said at that first slide, it gave staff a moment to kind of look back at our code and our requirements, and again, compared to some of the other things in which we regulate, items we regulate on our parcels. Landscaping was one that had minimal requirements regarding these issues. And so just in terms of overall concepts of these things, we're just looking for general feedback that staff to develop potential language for your consideration formally that helps us to develop kind of in a direction that, commission feels would be appropriate.
Okay, because the majority of the comments that were submitted for review talk about obstructed views, obstructed ocean views, which is really not a protected view within the city. So I just wanted to clarify, it's not just that. That's not the main focus. The focus is basically working to set up maintenance, overgrowth, things like that, on being able to regulate that.
Yes,
Okay.
I would say that's a good assessment.
And then the second question I have, how does it relate to a citywide ordinance, and then anything with respect to HOAs or say Monarch Bay Terrace, where they have the old county regulations there?
So similar to, I would say, a variety of areas in our town, we have portions of the town that are under HOAs, CCNRs. We have different specific plans that have different requirements. So I would say that for the areas where there's overlap, perhaps like in an HOA, like on the Monarch Beach areas, I would say probably what we enforce as the city is our city requirements. If an HOA has stricter requirements, then they'll deal with that at their neighborhood HOA level. So, and we've talked about that, for example, like when we talked about story pools, but we don't have that. Certain HOAs have story pools. So we enforce the city rules, and so that's what this would be, to potentially develop standards that we would enforce associated with landscaping. And then if any other particular area, whether it's the Dana Point specific plan, if there's particular, which there isn't, and or other HOAs have more strict requirements, we would look to see, we would enforce our requirements, and then potentially as part of this, we might do a reference like we did with the 2017 ordinance, how we did a specific plan to Dana Point specific plan, and we can work these types of changes in.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Could I just add to, because I think you raised a good point about HOAs, and so it's easy to think of this as like a property specific issue, but a lot of our homeowners associations maintain a lot of common area landscape. And so if we were to cultivate something and we wanted it to apply to HOAs, we would need to develop some kind of trigger as to when the new go forward development standards for landscaping would come into place, because it's not traditionally going to be triggered by like the demolition of a home per se.
Having dealt with view blockage issues, and landscaping is obviously 90%. So we have issues with building, but when we're talking about specifically with the enforcement, there would be required either staff or some mechanism in the associations. What happens is someone says there's something blocking my view. There's a committee. The committee goes out, and the key word is unreasonable. So if there's a palm tree and only the trunk is the thing in the view, the committee may say that's not unreasonable, even though there's a minor view blockage. So someone has to make a decision of what is or isn't reasonable, and I'm assuming we're talking about someone in the city would have to do that. And then when there's a disagreement, because obviously the person that has the tree may disagree, and the neighbors on each side may say that's not unreasonable. So then there's an appeal process, and the appeal process then would go from the landscape committee to the architectural or to the board of directors. So in this case, it would go from some city entity to probably city council or some entity, the city council. So we're talking about a significant process. We also not only have the neighborhood trees, but if you walk to the parks, we have very large trees and that block in Lantern Bay District. There's some trees that block some very expensive ocean views. So when you're talking about saying, well, we're going to do something that's going to change that. So when you talk about enforcement, then who pays? If you say that tree has to be removed, who's going to pay? And if we have trouble enforcing parking regulations where people are parking their cars on the street and they have many things filling their garage, I think we're going to have a huge enforcement process to do this. Then in Laguna Beach, people have talked about the historic. So how far do you go back to enforce? When I bought the house, there was no view blockage. Now there's a tree blocking my view. Who decides how far back we go, and who pays again? So the question of unreasonable, and I think the question of what do other cities that have these regulations, what are the benefits they've generated, what are the costs that they've incurred, and what are the problems that are still there. So I think before we create something out of whole cloth, we need to, I think it would be fair to bring back to us some existing examples of what exists, and those of us that have been working with view issues for 20 years, in one of the neighborhoods that's in Dana Point, we had people come in and complain about someone that wanted to build a second story, and you said, well, the houses on both sides are 2 stories, so if we allow someone to build this, if it goes up, that blocks somebody's view. So whether it's a tree or a building, whose property rights? So if we take away the right to build a second story and give it to a person in another property, so I think that's a property rights issue. So I think this is not as simple as saying what kind of trees. And if you said we want a height limit, and a lot of neighborhoods have height limits, then Dana Point is a beach city. Do you eliminate palm trees? So I think that is a place that I don't think we want to go. So, anyways, that's my comments.
As issues go, in my opinion, this is probably, these issues are really important because people buy their homes, they rent their homes, they want to live in areas that they choose, and maybe they choose to live in an area that has very mature trees. There are trees up in, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, trees up in Capistrano Beach that have been there for many, many decades. Huge trees. We have them in our yards, huge fruit-bearing trees. On the green belts between the sidewalks and the yards, wonderful landscaping. That has been placed there by the city over the years to make it a better place to live and to have folks enjoy where they live. I don't think this is an issue that can be taken lightly. I think all the ones that Commissioner Donor, Chair mentioned, and I don't think many people would agree that because someone does not like the position of a tree or doesn't like that tree, that's a reason to pull it out and then not replace or do replace. People live, we all know, all over this city in different areas for different reasons. And I think one of the most important reasons is our individuals who live here want to be able to make decisions about what they can do with their property, within limits, of course. So I'm not in it. I mean, to me, this is a large issue, and it deserves a lot more recommendations and a lot more resources put into this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think my fellow commissioners, and yourself included, covered most of my concerns, but I'm just going to go back through them just to make sure they get hit again. I do have a few questions. So I know you noted that other than hedge height limits, we don't have any other height limits. What are the hedge height limits? If you
In
don't-
the side and rear setbacks, 6 feet, and then in the front, 42 inches.
Did you say 6 feet?
Yes, sir.
And at what point are you not considered a what would be considered a hedge?
There's
Is
a
it
def-
really, if you lined up trees 5 feet away from the property line, it would still be a hedge?
It's not. There's a definition in our landscape ordinance regarding hedges. It's not necessarily a grouping of trees. It has to do with creating a visible barrier. I guess yes, trees could be a component of a hedge, but just a grouping of trees in one area may not meet the definition necessarily.
Yeah, so I'm thinking like Italian cypresses are used very often
Yes, you're right.
for view protection, and they effectively create a screen between whatever they're blocking.
I would say that's an excellent example of what would be considered a hedge. that
Okay,
particular
perfect.
plan.
That's sort of what I want to make sure. So I'll just go through a few of my concerns. So I don't, when we start talking height limits on trees, one of my concerns is that all height limits are not equal, especially in a city that is the topography that we have. In any one given spot, you can go 2 or 3 properties away, and you're going to see a 20 to 40 foot drop in elevation. So that 25 foot tall tree on one property, on the next one may block a view, but on another property it may be above a roof line. So the complexity of how we manage this, I think, is important. I don't think it's something that we should avoid. I think we should look at. I think Chairman Donor noted that maybe bring us some examples. We should be looking at what are the options, what's working, what's not working. To me, views and privacy are a two-way street. I have a home behind me that can see right into my house, and we have discussed putting up a tree, but it creates too much shade and there's other impacts, so we've had to go use other methods with blinds and stuff like that. But in any case, it's a two-way street. It's my job, if I can't keep my views between my neighbors separate, to cover myself up if I'm walking around my house, stuff like that. And I don't know how we address views versus privacy, but I think it's something that should be looked at. I do have a concern about the street trees. I took a different route here today just to look at what do our street trees look like, how many do we have. Our urban forest is important to a lot of different things, to birds, to shade in our environment. We're talking about walking distances and how far people will walk. They're not going to walk places if they don't have shade. So all of these things are important, and we should be looking at those. That was a great question about palm trees. How do we look at palm trees? Are palm trees, in many cases, are just big, tall, the Washingtonians, or a small stick that goes up and then fans out. Well, somebody's going to be blocked potentially by those views. How do we, dictate what the right size of a palm tree is versus an oak tree? I am concerned that we start to look at new development as the solution to this, because new development, there isn't a lot of it already. And the idea that we're going to see any major change is questionable there. And we shouldn't make it any harder than it already is, in my opinion. But I looked at some of these pictures, like this one that's up there now, and I don't know if this is safe or not safe, but I would assume we've got rules already in place to deal with unsafe conditions of overgrowth, and is that
We do have public nuisance standards. Generally, trees that the branches are encroaching into the pedestrian path. That would be the first trigger that we typically get involved in. But you can have overgrown for lack of a better word, that they're not impacting the pedestrian right away. It's not an issue, and we don't really have an enforcement mechanism to make them trim it back.
Okay. The other one that I question is what do we, if we're talking about views, what's the view? We have views, it's depending on where you live. You see city lights, you may see golf courses. If you're lucky enough, you'll see a golf course and the ocean, but not all views are equal. I could think of a few back here that they view the canyon, so we should be looking at really making sure we define that well. And I will go back to the street trees. So Dana Point has 37 street trees per 100 residents. And when you compare that to Laguna, they have 12. And I don't want to sacrifice our street trees for the purpose of protecting views for a select few. They should be for everybody. And I'm worried, these letters, I think, show that view protection creates challenges. We have two HOAs that appear to be at war here from what I'm reading. I don't know the substance of it, so I'm certainly reading into it, and I'll probably be corrected if I'm wrong, but it's two organizations that can't even solve a view problem. And so the idea that we can do that here throughout the entire city is, they're in a master HOA together. They should be able to work this out, and they can't. And how do we not create this type of problem? Would be one of my concerns, that we actually move forward with something that is reasonable, that's easy to, it's easy for staff to facilitate, and it's easy for homeowners, property owners to follow, and it's not a convoluted, challenging, bureaucratic process that makes it makes it difficult, if not impossible. And then one more comment was just making sure we're clear on what view direction we're talking about. Is it just one-way views, or is it two-way views? I think that's it for my comments. Thanks.
Sean, one of the things that happened is when I heard Commissioner Murphy talk about the trees, the mature trees in some of the HOAs where people don't have a view, they have some large trees in their areas, and in our particular neighborhood, every tree is numbered, and there's nobody that can take that tree out with a full vote of the board of directors. I mean, people, they love those trees. They don't have a view, and that's something that's extremely important. So we're talking about two different areas. We're protecting the trees, and then in some areas people want to take them out. So this is a huge issue that is certainly not going to be solved by the Planning Commission tonight. But I think we've given you a lot of feedback, and I think we need from you then some more information about what other cities have done and what they're doing and what the pros and cons are of what successes and what failures they've had. So, yes.
Yeah, in listening to you, I guess one of the issues is, again, as we're talking about, what do we want Dana Point to look like? And I think everybody has to sit down and figure that out for their own edification and figure out what do we want Dana Point to be. We talk about that, whether we're talking about Dana Point in some other areas, but when it comes to the trees, the bushes, whatever the greenery is, that's something that you can't reverse it once you take down a big tree. You can't reverse that. So I think this is going to take a lot of discussion and a lot of smart suggestions about the issue.
After hearing my fellow commissioners' comments, which I thought were all extremely insightful, I just want to, mention that I agree wholeheartedly that this is very important and very massively difficult and with tons of nuance and relative to applicability, lot by lot, and tons of things. It seems to me anything we did would need to be extremely well thought through and gone through, and would be problematic to enforce. So I just wanted to kind of echo those thoughts of my fellow commissioners.
Yes.
I believe we have one public speaker. Before we open it up for the comment, I just want to say, as staff, we appreciate the feedback, and we do appreciate this is a complex issue, and one of the main goals for us is figuring out a way to sort of unpack this moving forward. And while we did, sort of come in at a high level, it's very helpful, the feedback you gave us tonight, and I'm sure we can come back and get more focused in on some of the specific issues you brought up. I just wanted to mention that.
So we have a public speaker for the landscape.
Thank you very
Julian
much.
Joshua.
Julian Joshua, resident of Dana Point, and I think we can all agree, and I'm glad that you said it tonight, this is an incredibly complicated issue, and we all need to do our homework before we go forward, and it is a long process. That said, I do want to correct Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, I'm not here in pursuit of a dispute between one HOA and another. You actually said we were all members of the same master association. We are not. One HOA, as you know, cannot enforce the rules of another HOA. And some HOAs, in particular the one that was involved in litigation that cost millions for years and years about basically nothing, and basically about misconduct at the level of an HOA board, but it had an effect on trees. That is something that should play into your discussions. And the case is Eckerstrom against Marquesa HOA, and I'm sure your deputy city attorney will be able to tell you all about that case because it's part of the case law of Orange County tree law and view law. By the way, the judge found that one frond obstructing a view was an obstruction, but it's a very interesting case to read. I think we can all agree that we love our trees. We can also agree that we love our views, and in Dana Point we love our ocean views. We can also agree, probably, and you probably have experience here, that by common agreement, a good view would add anything between 10 to 20% to the value of a home. So if you're in a row of, or if you're on a street and one side has an ocean view and the other does not, there's probably a difference of up in the comparables of 10% or more. If you're actually close to the ocean, it is apparently up to 20%. I wasn't able, in the very short notice we had of this meeting, and I haven't even seen a staff paper, to get you hard data, but I'm sure that that will be forthcoming and can be prepared. With regard to, I've come here today really to advocate on behalf of a view ordinance, and I would ask you to adopt the model of Laguna Beach. They have done it very well, and they have had it since 2003. But the important thing about the Laguna Beach ordinance, sorry if I can say two things, it is not only going forward, it is actually so protecting existing views, it actually allows for a view restoration process. That is to say, and it's specifically in paragraph, it's in the definitional section of Ordinance 1592 of Laguna Beach, and it is also well, I'm sorry about that. Can I have a little bit more time?
Sorry, we got another meeting coming up.
Okay, well, I'm sorry didn't have enough time to go through it. This is an extremely complicated issue. I would ask you to look at the Laguna ordinance, and in particular, I would ask you to have a procedure for restoration of historical views, and you will see that there's provision for that in the Laguna ordinance, so that even if you had an existing view, 20 years...
Thank you. Thank you. We have another speaker.
Okay. Well, I'll ask you to take that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm Huan Yep again. First, I want to say that you guys gave many really good comments from the second I walked in, so thank you. I have two comments. One is it's interesting that you suggest a plant list. I think the Water District would love it. On the other hand, I think this could also be our, we can showcase this. For instance, the HOAs, even if they're grandfathered in, they should know our plant list, because some trees die, things like that. On the other hand, Deborah Lewis has been talking about the city has a code that the empty lots need to be landscaped. So the empty lot owners should have our new plant list. Trees. So I go to a lot of different city council meetings. It's just so boring. I just sit there waiting for my turn to speak, and those neighbors just go there to talk about trees. So I had an episode about a tree in my backyard. So one day I came home, a third of the tree was gone. And so, I mean, it's a big tree, so that's probably grandfathered in. And so my next door immediately told me, it's a guy behind. It must be, that's this ocean view. So the place was empty for a long time after the last family moved out. And so when I came along, I saw this tree obviously was not trimmed, was hacked by someone. So everybody says it was next door. So now I know it's not next door. So, and then I was like, oh, well, I don't want to go to, this boring conversation. Other neighbors all came to tell me, so the story just built up. So eventually I went to the guy behind me, and he's like, yeah, well, so what? So, I mean, I just didn't want to get into that debate. So from what I heard in other city councils, there's like in Corona del Mar, people even don't want street sweeping because then you will have a sign for the time of the street sweeping. That blocks the view too. I mean, so where do we go with this? This is really complicated. I don't know. My personal experience is like, I'm not going to, I don't want to. It's such a neighborly thing, right?
All right, we're going to we'll adjourn this workshop, and the Planning Commission will rejoin at 6 o'clock for our regular scheduled planning meeting.